systems. Today, we're going to be talking about the global landscape with some excellent guests that we have up here for you. If you are looking for further information on this educational series, you can go to institute.dmns.org. We'll be getting started in about just a minute here. Go ahead and open the chat at the bottom of your screen and let us know where you're viewing from.
Hello, welcome everyone to our webinar series, Everything on the Table, Reimagining Our Global to Local Food Systems. Thank you for joining us today. I am Kristin. I'm the director at the Institute for Science and Policy at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. Before we kick off, I want to recognize and thank our partners and friends in this series for helping you bring us this three-part webinar. They have been true thought leaders in this work themselves and excellent partners. So thank you to the University of Denver's Joseph Corbell School for International Studies and the Environmental Sustainability Initiative, as well as the Colorado State University System's new Spur campus, including the International Agriculture Program. I know we actually have a couple of watch parties joining us today from both of the universities. Hello, a big shout out to them if you're one of the students joining us for one of the watch parties. So climate change and our global food systems are absolutely deeply intertwined. It's from the land use to the soil practices, to our water management and energy production, all the way to our human livelihoods associated with agriculture. In this three-part series that we're bringing you today, we're going to be diving really deep into the complexities of this interconnected system. Climate change is here, and it's continuing to put pressure on our food systems. It's will continue to put pressure on our food systems, especially as our global populations expand. So today is the first step in this three-part journey, and we're going to look at a really big picture, and we're going to take on the global food system today, which we understand is a really big topic, which is why we have an hour-and-a-half conversation, and we have amazing guests joining us today to help us tackle some of these big complex issues, solutions, and challenges to both resiliency and sustainability. So I don't want to spend much time talking. I want to go ahead and welcome and introduce our guest today. Our moderator for today is both one of our partners and a dear friend of the Institute. It's Carrie Wright-Flatais. Carrie is a special advisor to the Chancellor and the Director of International Agriculture Program at CSU's Spur campus, which of course I said is new because it's opening in 2022 with a focus on the interface between food, water, and health. She is a thought leader in international agriculture development with more than 25 years experience in the design, management, implementation, and scaling of innovative ideas. She is also one of the advisors to the Institute, so I get to work with Carrie quite frequently. Our three panelists today, we have Amaka Anku, who is the head of Eurasia Group's Africa practice. Amaka helps clients understand the interaction of politics, policy, and markets across sub-Saharan Africa. She is also a member of the firm's global macro practice, where she focuses on comparative global politics. Also joining us today is Mafet Gugi, who is the Supervisory Agricultural Development Officer at the Center for Agriculture Production Systems Division for USAID. He leads the Food Integrated Systems for Food Production team, working on issues related to agriculture, nutrition, and natural resource management. His current role at USAID is to collaborate with all stakeholders across climate change concerns in agricultural production in order to improve our food security and nutrition. And our third guest today is Claudia Ringler, who is the Deputy Division Director for the Environment and Production Technology Division at the International Food Policy Research Institute. Claudia's research focuses on global water and food security, gender water and gender climate change linkages, as well as the synergies between climate adaptation and mitigation. So we are in great hands today. Before I pass this over to Carrie, I just want to remind our guests who are joining us here on Zoom or on one of our social channels, whether you're watching on Facebook or on YouTube, that we want to hear your questions. We will get to the latter half of the program. We'll start incorporating some of those questions into the discussion. So we encourage you to open that chat if you're on Zoom, or use the comment feature on one of our social platforms to send your questions in. We have eyes on those, and we'll try to work some of them into the discussion. And let me give you my apologies in advance that I'm pretty sure we probably will not get to all of your great questions, but we'll do our best to incorporate as many as possible. So with that, thank you for joining us today. And let me turn this over to Carrie. Hi, Carrie, welcome.
Hi, Kristin. Thank you so much. And thanks to DMNS and the Science and Policy Institute for bringing us all together today. I know we have a little bit of internet issues, so some of us might go off camera when we need to, just to keep things moving, but we're really excited for this conversation today. As we all know, no civilization has thrived or survived without a vibrant agricultural system. The issues are holistic and multidimensional approach, one that involves cross-sectoral work and multidisciplinary approaches. We also really depend on innovation. And I hope today, with the conversation that we create and the discussion that we have, that this comes through clearly, and some of the opportunities and even hopeful opportunities. Looking forward to speaking with our panel. It's a real treat to have this group of experts with us who have dedicated their careers to solving and addressing some of the big issues surrounding our climate change, food production, and the intricate solutions needed to address food systems as a whole. As Kristin mentioned, as well.
Carrie, we're having
I'm
Carrie, you're pretty intermittent for us. Make sure your camera's off if that's okay.
Everyone caught that.
No,
Panelists
Carrie.
First.
Carrie, let's go ahead and turn to our panelists. Your internet's pretty unstable right now, and I haven't heard very much of what you've had to say.
Oh dear. Okay,
Oh dear.
Why don't we start with and kick off with
Thanks, Carrie. I think she said, let's go ahead and kick off with Claudia. Claudia, when you're ready, if you want to go ahead and share your slides, introduce yourself, and kick us off with some opening remarks.
Happy to do that. So I was asked to talk about the global food system, which is really the topic of the entire session. And it's a very big topic. So to just be very clear, I will really just touch very lightly on the system. And I'll focus on a few challenges and a few opportunities. So what you hopefully can see on my screen here on the left are key elements of the food system, or what we also say food systems, because there are many of these out there. Compared to the more traditional focus on food production, the food system also considers value chains in the food environment, which is everything affecting food consumption choices. And while the elements shown here on the left look like a very neat circle, distribution, processing, marketing, preparation, and consumption, in reality, there are, of course, thousands of circles. They're commodity specific, they are location specific. Some of them, of course, are global. Just think about a chocolate bar, or even, a beer or a glass of wine. So for the chocolate, the cocoa might be sourced from West Africa, the sugar may be from Brazil, the milk may be from the United States. So we really have very interconnected food systems out there. So unsurprisingly, this system is really large, and it's not just large in terms of the GDP generates, but also in terms of employment, and particularly in terms of employment. Globally, about 25% of all people employed out there are employed in agricultural production. So basically just one small sliver of the food system, the direct production side in the field, on the farm, on the pasture. But of course, as economies develop, there has been a shift. So fewer and fewer people are involved in direct farming, and more people are involved and employed in the overall food system. And that's what you can see here on the right. So in the United States, for example, the food system together accounts for about 5.2% of GDP, 2019 numbers, while production itself only accounted for 0.6% of GDP. The same if you look at the job side. So we have 22 million jobs in the food system in 2019 in the United States. And again, the farming employment out of those 22 million was 2.6 million. So that's when we think about the food system, it just goes really beyond the production side. And of course, this graph on the right would look very differently in low and middle income countries, where we still have most jobs, or at least the majority of jobs, in the food system directly in the agricultural production space. And there, a lot of the beverage stores and the informal food vendors and so forth, they're part of the informal economy. They don't even appear, they don't generally appear on these graphs. So just to make it clear, food systems are essential for each one of us. We basically wouldn't exist without having these systems operating for us. And I think in recognition of the importance of those food systems, the United Nations for the first time this year had called for a food systems summit that led to commitments from most UN member states, but also many other actors, to support food system transformation, to increase the access to more nutritious food, make food consumption patterns more sustainable, improve production systems, support equitable livelihoods, and improve resilience to climate and other stressors. The US government, for example, pledged to spend $10 billion to advance these UN Food System Summit goals, with half of the funds to be spent in the United States and half through the Feed the Future program in more low-income environments. So what are some of the key challenges and opportunities in this global system? I can really just only touch on two of these here, and each of them is very big. The first one is inequity in access to food. There are many indicators that show this huge inequity that we see in access to food. And of course, inequity exists anywhere and everywhere, but there is some very strong global and regional differences. So currently about 800 million people are undernourished, so they do not have enough food for a healthy life. That's about 10% of humanity, of all of us, so it's huge. Children are particularly affected by undernutrition. And in 2020, the last numbers that we have, about 20% of all children below the age of 5 were too short for their age because of a lack of access to nutritious food. This often means lower cognitive skills, lower lifetime earning capabilities, and more or less, those are lost generations. It's not all a negative story, of course. The share had been much higher, so it actually has come down from about 33% 20 years ago to the 20% that we see today. But of course, this is still not what we want to see. So as long as we do have children without access to sufficient food, I think we have a very large moral obligation to do better. There are, of course, many other indicators. This map shows another indicator of inequity in access to food and to all of the items that the food system can provide. And it shows the increase in the number of people at risk of hunger as a result of climate change out to 2050. So clearly, climate change does affect hunger everywhere in the globe, but not equally. Sub-Saharan Africa, the largest expected increases in terms of hunger as a result of climate change, but also large increases in South Asia, where currently most of the food insecure population reside. Yet further, maybe last indicator to suggest or to mention here is the access to healthy diets. And there have been calculations done over the last year or two that have shown that based on incomes and based on the food costs in those various parts of the globe, 85% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa and 76% of South Asia's population cannot afford a healthy diet because their incomes are not high enough and food prices are too high, and many of them are farmers. As a comparison, in the United States, the same calculations have shown that slightly more than 3 million people cannot afford a healthy diet right now, and the number obviously has increased as a result of COVID-19. And what is an affordable diet? In these calculations, a diet was considered unaffordable if it costs more than 63% of a household's income. So you should not spend more than 63% of your income on food. If you have to, you really cannot afford a healthy diet. So this sounds a lot like doom and gloom, but of course it's not all doom and gloom. There are opportunities across this entire food system space to reduce the cost of food, to improve access to cheaper and more nutritious food options such as vegetables, fruits, eggs, and milk. For example, innovative technologies for cold storage, solar cold storage, improved increased expansion of small-scale irrigation options, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in South Asia. So these particular interventions don't only allow the production of more nutritious food, the availability of hopefully cheaper food on the markets, but also they can grow the incomes of those smallholder farmers who are more often undernourished than urban dwellers, at least in low and middle income countries. Another suggestion is biofortification of staple foods that poor people already can afford, such as cassava or wheat or rice with micronutrients. So that's a further opportunity that's currently being rolled out in parts of the world. The second challenge I would just like to highlight, and also obviously the second opportunity, are the environmental impacts of food systems. And yes, those impacts are generated throughout the food value chain. We have trucks that obviously emit greenhouse gases that move food around. There are people wasting food, even that emits greenhouse gases and can cause water pollution and so forth. But the majority of the environmental impact in the food system is still generated on the production side. And those numbers here, I think, speak for themselves. About a quarter of global greenhouse gases come from the ag system. 50% of habitable land is used by agriculture, by food production. 70% of global freshwater withdrawals are used in agriculture production. Close to 80% freshwater pollution linked to agriculture production, and a whopping 94% of biodiversity loss linked to agriculture. Even COVID-19 is indirectly an outcome of inadequate natural resource management that has brought wildlife and humans more closely together. Obviously, among others, because we're cutting down forests to produce more food. So farming as usual is not an option. And this was also reflected in the United Nations Food System Summit's call for better production system, or nature positive production. There are a lot of solutions out there focusing particularly on protecting as much tropical forest habitat as possible, because these forests harbor the most species richness and abundance. So if we can focus on accelerated yield improvement instead of area expansion, we can really start to bring those red bars down. And once we bring the biodiversity bar down, we obviously will also make improvements in lots of the other bars that you see here. But the task is major. And I just wanted to, while we have these numbers and we can certainly focus on intensification and conservation of lands in countries like the United States, in low and middle income countries, population growth requires more or less doubling of cereal production and an increase in animal source food production of more or less 75%. So the task is huge. The opportunities are out there. We know with precision agriculture technologies, with climate resilient seeds, we can really conserve many of these natural resources while producing more food. with better grain storage, we can reduce aflatoxin risks and thus also retain more of the food that we have produced. So all of these bars have to work together, and we all have to work together to make this work. So just to conclude, I hope I've left you with more or less 3 thoughts. The challenges facing these food systems are tremendous, and the 2 key ones that I see is inequity in access and the environmental impact of these food systems. And the inequity, I think the big issue really is this very continued high levels of undernutrition, in fact, growing levels of undernutrition in low and middle income countries. At the same time, we need to do better on the production side to reduce the environmental impact. We can and need to do better on the inequity side across the entire value chain. And to conclude, investment in agriculture R&D.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Claudia, thank you so much.
Carrie, we're still having some audio issues with you. We're getting about 1 word out of every 10 or 20. So just so folks know, a number of us are here in the Denver metro area, and we're having some internet issues pretty across the city and area, as I've been told. So Carrie's going to work on that. I'm going to go ahead and pass this over and welcome Amaka to join us in this conversation. Hi, Amaka. Welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Hi. Okay, let me share my screen real quick so that I can put up presentation. Okay. So, can everybody see this? Or can you, Kristin? Okay, I think we're all set. Yes. Okay. So, I think this is a great talk. I'm just going to follow up with what Claudia was saying, and I want to start with how interlinked our food systems are, right? So Claudia was saying, we just saw that chart up there that 26% of global emissions comes from agricultural production. And so I wanted to connect it to this. This is a picture of the climate impact in sub-Saharan Africa, right? And as you can see, most of the most intense impacts is, it has been in and around the area that we call the Sahel in West Africa. So that's Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso, Senegal. This is an area that historically, and still is today, so I'll show you some data on this, but historically, a significant proportion of economic activity is from agriculture and still is. And even more proportion of the population depend on agriculture in one way or the other for their livelihoods. And so you can imagine how this level of climate impact and drying has had significant displacement, right, on a lot of these livelihoods. So this starting in around the 1970s, there was significant droughts, recurrent droughts that displaced a lot of farmers, herders, fishermen from in a lot of these regions. And I would argue today that it's not a coincidence that this area has some of the worst political instability in the region, right? In part because of these displacements. Mind you, a lot of this started, just kind of to give you a little bit of context, in the 1970s, a lot of these countries were barely 10 years old, right? Barely 10 years into a new experiment as independent states, going through this natural process of trying to figure out the political settlements, right, after they became independent. So very major displacements to food systems that is a huge impact. And I started here to say that, when you think about like the way that we produce our food here in the United States, right, that, a lot of the 26% of global emissions coming from agriculture, it's not coming from here, right? It's coming from more sort of a lot of the, Africa, sub-Saharan Africa in general, except for South Africa, which is still pretty small, is a pretty small emitter, right? In terms of the global, but so this kind of tells you how it's all connected, right? Like we might be commercialized agriculture, intense livestock in industrialized nations, it's having an impact on how we produce food, you know, in other parts of the world, right? And it continues to be, so move to the next slide. Sub-Saharan Africa continues to be now, in addition to having some of the driest parts of the world now, it continues to be pretty vulnerable in some of these areas to drying and desertification, right? So I'm going to skip, I want to show you this again, just a little bit more context. And then I will focus on a case study of Nigeria. But to give you a sense, so these are the Sahel countries I was talking about: Chad, Niger, Mali, Kenya. Agriculture, forestry, fishing, all a pretty huge, significant part of gross domestic output, economic activity, right? It's over 40% in Chad, nearly 40% in Niger and Mali. And some of the other major countries, you can see Nigeria is over 20%. And at the same time, these countries have some of the least ability to address the impact, in part because of the disruption, of course, not all, but in part because of the disruption also from climate change, which hurts productivity, which hurts the ability to collect revenue, and so on and so forth, right? So this just shows you sort of budgeted spending, right? This is the US with, you know, maybe less than 1% of economic activity from agriculture, but it's spending almost, you know, nearly 1% more on agriculture than some of these countries, right? So I'm gonna, you know, I wanna now just spend the rest of my time giving you a little bit of a picture of what this looks like concretely, and maybe how to start thinking about solutions, what we do from here. So this is Lake Chad, which is it used to be a pretty, you know, fairly substantial lake in the Sahel area. And as you can see, between 1963 and 2013, it's almost disappeared, right? And as all of these drying is happening, what we're seeing is that the pastoralists and farmers around this area and fishermen, I mean, they've all had to move mostly to cities where there were not a lot of jobs for them. It's obviously driven a lot of the militant extremism because they're, you know, young, unemployed people with nothing to do. But one of the, you know, very current issues that we're currently looking at facing now in Nigeria specifically is the pastoralists and how this is impacting sort of how we raise cattle. There's a very huge demand for beef. It's a very popular food, so there's a big demand for it, but historically, the pastoralists used to graze around this area. The more we're seeing the desertification, the more they're being pushed down to the south. At the same time that you're seeing population growth, which has caused farms to expand. The, you know, previously available grazing areas have been lost to the desertification or settled or allocated for farmland. And so it's causing a lot of conflicts and clashes between pastoralists and farmers. In a context where of extreme ethnic diversity, so a lot of the pastoralists come from a particular ethnic group in this entire region called the Fulanis, and farmers could be Fulani sometimes, but now that they're being pushed further and further south, they're often not from that same ethnic group. So this has become, you know, it's now kind of tapping into the sort of regional identity fault lines, and which is really inhibiting a response. So for example, the Nigerian government recently, at the height of this year was really, I mean, I'll say the past few years has been the height of all of these conflicts between herders and farmers. And there's a proposal on the table to, first of all, expand some of these grazing areas. I would say there's not enough focus on that, but then also to create more ranches in and around grazing areas as a way to induce some pastoralists to settle. Potentially, there has been some sedentarization of pastoralists over the years and the decades, so it's possible over time. But also to encourage some, you know, the co-location of some of these, you know, farms, some of the I would say the historical practices of farm of pastoralists used to be able to graze the land when farmers weren't farming it, right? And then, and their drop-ins would be manure and so on and so forth. And then now, because of changes in rainfall, we're seeing that farmers are either farming all year round, or they've changed their farming practices, again, which is causing sort of that symbiotic relationship to be disrupted and causing more conflict. But what I found fascinating, and when I watched Kiss the Ground, I watched it and I thought this was really fascinating, is that the biggest proposal on the table, there's a big pushback to this plan to create more grazing reserves, co-locate some ranches, create a whole ecosystem in and around these grazing systems. And the big pushback is, well, we don't want these Fulanis to come and take over our land. Instead, they should be forced to buy land and do intense cattle farming like they do in the United States. That's sort of supposedly the model. And so that these conflicts go away, right? And so, I would end here. One of the things that I think is really fascinating watching Kiss the Ground is how this traditional practice that is now becoming the source of conflict and is being so politicized and ethnicized is actually something that could help to heal the ground and help to sequester carbon if there is enough, if you can raise awareness about it, right? And figure out how to, awareness is very important, but preserve some of these practices in a way that is feasible for the modern world. I think that there is, so I would hope, one of my hopes is that somehow this conversation we're having today and the conversation that I saw in Kiss the Ground, that we can raise awareness about some of these issues, because it's issues that we're dealing with in faraway places like Nigeria. How do you deal with livestock production for today's world in a context of sort of more and more scarce land and so on and so forth? So, I'm excited to kind of think more creatively about how to do this. And so I'll stop there, and hopefully I can answer any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Amaka. That was really interesting. Thank you for the deep dive on Nigeria as well. We're going to move on to Moffat and then have some conversation amongst the panelists before going forward. Moffat, please.
Thank you, Carrie, and glad a little bit the internet is coming back. I want first of all to acknowledge everybody that has joined us. Thank you so much with all the live viewers and maybe anybody who will follow this later. I think the context has been said very well from Claudia, from Maku. And one of the things that is very exciting is a lot of the discussions happening on United Nations food systems and what we will do to both meet the needs for food security as well as cope with climate change. I work with the US Agency for International Development, and part of our role, of course, is in implementing a lot of the work that the US government supports overseas to address hunger and malnutrition and poverty. But I want to start off maybe a little bit setting the context as well, relating to basically the trajectory humanity has taken and the predicament we find ourselves in today. So I think several references have been made to Kiss the Ground. There's a lot of discussion on what's happening. I know we certainly have a very particular audience here in Colorado, all the farmers, ranchers, educators, academicians, researchers. There is so much that kind of needs to be dealt with and handled as relates to both climate change and food security. And the trajectory that we've had is that basically we've been living in what may be thought of as a golden age of agriculture, where for maybe the last 10,000 years, for majority of human history, we just always had sort of a little bit of your hunter-gatherer kind of livelihoods. And 10,000 years ago or so, there was the agrarian revolution, and some will argue that it actually really domesticated us human beings, not the other way around. But in any case, we had the agrarian revolution, and that has sort of set us on a path where we've had the way that we feed ourselves and our communities throughout. Industrial revolution came around, and we see a doubling down of how we use land and how we implement our agricultural activities, where a majority of the people started moving into cities, and rural areas were then left mostly with fewer people, but again with a lot of industrial solutions to feeding people. And we really did overcome major challenges that had been expected in terms of food shortages and so on. And then coming all the way into the Green Revolution, where again, another level of intensification happened, where we saw a lot of productivity go up, major hunger problems thwarted, especially in the India and Pakistan and the Indus Valley. But the Green Revolution also left us with quite a bit of some negative other elements relating to social and environmental impact on the ground. And this is even yet before we had begun really contemplating or confronting what we see with climate change. So as we turn into the 20th century right now, a key effort that we now have is a thinking around how we are going to intensify. And I saw already in the chat somebody asking, how is it that we're going to really be meeting these challenges while preserving our environment and our resources? And a key idea that has come up is sort of sustainable agriculture intensification. Things like regenerative agriculture, climate smart agriculture. All these are concepts that I think have been very well researched. I know stellar institutions such as Denver and Colorado State University do really good work training people in terms of understanding our natural resources and how we use them. And really deploying that is going to be a key thing that we will need to make sure is more broadly adopted in order for us to overcome the challenges relating to food security, as well as dealing with climate change. So what I wanted then to share is basically what we as USAID, an agency of the US government, do in addressing some of these issues. We've been heavily involved in all of the discussions relating to United Nations Food Systems Summit. There've been a lot of concepts developed for sort of boosting nature positive agriculture, so that we nature positive production, so that the kind of, whether it's our grains, whether it's our animal production, whether it's our fisheries, how can we do it more sustainably? The bureau that I work with actually implements the US government's flagship effort on hunger and malnutrition globally. And we work to basically address three big items: agriculture-led economic growth, that's number one, resilience, especially of people and systems, and nutrition. So all these are things that we care deeply about. And the US government actually expends basically what amounts to $1 billion annually in agriculture. Of course, this is money that is collected from you all, taxpayers of the United States. And this money is going toward really tackling hunger and so on. And about 60% of that $1 billion is, so we're talking about almost 600 million annually, is going into really looking at how we do sustainable agriculture in a better way. So basically your sustainable agricultural intensification. So more than 1/3 of USAID's annual agriculture innovation funding goes to the private sector. This is an important issue. And I hope that the community, both from Denver Museum as well as throughout Colorado, and participants joining us, can really kind of see how we need to be networking together so that you understand part of the work that's getting done, both here domestically in the US, but also how it interlinks with overseas work. We do fund a lot of work, research with various US universities through our Feed the Future Innovation Labs. And that is actually an avenue where we see a lot of technology transfer to countries that can utilize these ideas and innovations in the tropics. But actually also, we see a lot of transfer backward, actually, where we are seeing innovations in dealing with drought, dealing with floods, innovations that are emerging from basically the global south and how it can be implemented here in the United States, especially as we now continue facing climate change and our typical weather and climatic conditions continue to evolve. So there are going to be a lot of opportunities for us to teach each other and to learn from each other in terms of how to do sustainable agriculture. So overall, I think I will just sort of end by saying that more than 15% of our agricultural innovation budget is on sustainable agricultural intensification. And so an estimated 100 million annually, of which about 70 million supports research, knowledge, and education systems. The kinds of platforms and outreach that we are exactly doing in this kind of a forum. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion today and additional follow-ups that folks may have relating to our work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Moffat. That was excellent. And I appreciate, can we turn on our cameras for Amaka and Claudia as well? Let's hope and pray our internet stays stable and we can have a conversation amongst ourselves. And then we've got some great conversation and questions coming in from the audience. So we will get to that. But I'd like to hear a little back and forth from taking it at the larger global scale initially, and the focus in and on Africa. Amaka, thank you for that information. And then back to how US government, and is funding and working with both private and public sector. I think that's a very important focus for us as well. But what has kicked up that you guys would like to really emphasize in terms of how climate is impacting our global scenario and what we can do about it as individuals? Our next steps. What are your thoughts on that? Can you hear me? Or am I cutting out? Go ahead, Claudia. Go ahead, Moffat.
No, Claudia, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just I guess a little anecdote. So what can each of us do about this? There was I think a Gallup World Poll recently, that asked 1,000 or more people in so many countries of the world, more high-income countries, what they would think would be the best steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And top on the list was, plant more trees, more climate smart farming. And imagine what was on the bottom of the list. What were the smallest number of respondents were interested to change their consumption habits, and that's specifically meat products. So very few people were interested to change their own consumption habits. And of course, we have 8 to 9 billion food consumers, and we do not have that many producers. And so the idea is that the producers, at least that particular poll suggests, to put all of the emphasis on the producers. And I think we are beyond that. So we can't wait for producers to become yet more efficient and more climate smart. So I think, we have to think a little bit further what we can do also on the consumption side and the entire value chain. So yeah, I mean, anyone who's very serious about making a difference to the climate, and I'm not saying becoming a vegan, but just to think a little bit more on the margin. What are small changes that every consumer can make? And that's also not just changing what you eat, or not necessarily, but how often do you eat out? Do you actually complete your meal? Do you bring food home? How much of the food in your fridge are you actually throwing out because in the end you didn't know what to do with it? So I think those are some of the questions for every person to consider. And it's not, of course, just food. It's also, what do you do in your own garden? How do you, what are the plants you grow? I mean, are you trying to be more climate conscious in everything that you do? So yeah, that would be my quick answer.
And mine would be
That's great.
similar to Claudia. I think very important to think about our own consumption patterns. And as we think about our own, we think about our households, we think about our community, and certainly we as nations or modern nation states. So one other thing I can say is very, very important is really the conversation. the conversation so that we can inspire and enable people. Because it's one thing to say, don't do this, do that, do that. A little bit better understanding, a little bit better public science understanding of the linkages of what it means when you kind of have a certain kind of a profile for a diet, and what is the footprint of that diet, for instance. And to me, I feel the discussion relating to collective understanding, so that we have a common understanding of what it means, because it wouldn't pay anything if we all are in all little tribes all over the place. We need to have collective action as a globe, and that is why people in Colorado ought to care what's going on in the rest of the United States, in the rest of the world. And that collective action and collective thinking is part of what is going to be a big solution. It has brought us thus far as humanity, and it really can take us to another level if we think that globally, but then acting locally. Over.
So, you know, from the perspective of the periphery of the global economy, which is not just Africa, but a lot of other developing countries, where you haven't contributed, where countries and peoples and communities and societies have not contributed that much to global emissions, but are at the receiving end of some of the most severe impacts, I think what is most important from that perspective is really awareness about what is driving some of these impacts, right? So, and I think there needs to be more investment, and I can understand why there isn't, but like, say for example, in Nigeria, or in Senegal, or in Mauritania, or even in Kenya, there isn't enough awareness in the domestic political discourse of just how much displacement is happening because of climate change, right? So it's not even, it's not a question of mitigation, because it's not like people should change their eating practices because they're not emitting that much, right? It's really more about adaptation. It's really more about building resilience. But in order to actually have the political will to push to build the resilience, you have to let people understand that this is actually a problem. And it's a vicious cycle, because you can't truly develop, you can't drive productivity until you can drive productivity in your agricultural sector. And if you're not acknowledging that climate change is impacting productivity in your agricultural sector, you'll never get enough productivity to build the resources you need to invest in building resilience. So I would love to see USAID, US government, various private institutions in the US and wherever, invest more resources in actually building more awareness underground in some of these places. And in part, because we are the ones in America and in Western Europe that are emitting the most, that are impacting these people. I think we should be investing in ensuring that people understand that some of the actions of industrialization for many decades is helping to drive this issue. And yes, we need to organize to fix it, to address it.
Thank you, Amaka. That's great. Thank you all. I'm going to take a couple questions because our friends at DMNS have kindly highlighted a few for us from the DU Watch Party. The question is there a way to address international supply chain issues without an international authority? What do you all think in terms of how we address international supply chain issues?
I could quickly speak to it because it did come up in the chat a little bit. And so, yes, there is the World Trade Organization. So we do have one authority that obviously has faced a lot of challenges in trying to level the playing field for agricultural trade and agricultural commodities. People engaged in, there's a lot of people engaged in the costs and the benefits. I mean, the costs of having poor trading systems and the benefits of improved trading systems. So we are talking here about, straight export of grains, like who is protecting which commodity. So when for example, when we do have droughts, we talk about climate change. What happens? So countries become concerned that they might run out of storage of these staple foods, especially countries that might not produce a lot and depend very much on imports. So then protection starts and so forth. So yeah, the cost of allowing countries to restrict trade of these essential commodities is extremely high. It also leads to speculation, huge food insecurity, malnutrition outcomes. So the role for that existing global trading system is immense, but the politicians, unfortunately, continue to not follow good trading practices whenever a challenge such as a drought looms. So that's an area where we need to work on more. We need more global commitment, I think, from the main players. But it is a challenge that's growing given, these additional climate extreme events that we're expecting out there.
Agreed.
I'll be curious to hear a little bit from Amaka actually on this, but one of the things that I also think is quite important is the regional trading blocks, because in addition to maybe what you can think of as a global or international authority, there are really these very important regional trading blocks. I know across Africa, for instance, there's been the African Free Trade, So those kind of arrangements may ease the trade in essential commodities, but it may also ease the way to trading with other blocks, say the EU, the Asian countries, North America, and so on. Over.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is, as I highlighted earlier, which is for Africa, it's about resilience and mitigation, right? It's not about so I do think that ECOWAS and, CODESRIA and SADC could do a much better job, especially ECOWAS, because ECOWAS is the Sahel, these things have been driving conflicts in the region. I think they really should be doing a much better job of raising awareness about the issue. So that's a really good point. I'm even going to look into it. Do they have a climate section, and what are they doing? So I definitely think that's a really big one. But I think that a part of the problem for organizations like ECOWAS is that it's just so low on the priorities when you have conflicts and poverty and blah, 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 that people are focusing on all these other issues without recognizing that this climate issue is driving all of the above.
Thank you, guys. That was good. Let's take a look at, we've got a question from a Corbell student. In how can we or should we convince traditional rural farmers to change their agricultural practices when often their practices are rooted in cultural and historical identities? So how are we addressing that, perhaps through USAID in terms of on the ground? Are we running into conflicts, or do we see that we can introduce innovation and also still honor the historical context, the cultural context of the countries we work in? Moffitt, would you like to take that?
Yes, I can take that one. I'll be also curious to hear what others think on this one. My own take is that I think sometimes there is a little bit of a romanticization of the traditional, the indigenous peoples of a certain place and how they've lived for 100 years or 1,000 years, or where people expect or think that because they've been doing it that way, that's the way that they know how, and that's the way they want to keep doing it. The truth of the matter is that when we are actually implementing activities for food security, we abide by the Rome principles, basically the idea that nothing about them without them, right? So we have a lot of community consultations. We have a lot of consultations with national leaders, with regional leaders, across the board, religious leaders even. And typically people pick and choose what they feel will be the very most important thing for them to focus on. I can give you an example, for instance, in Uganda, where the team was attempting to do this value chain activity this is near the Ankole, the southwestern region. And the local community said, no, we don't want to do agricultural crops. We want a cattle project, because this is the cattle corridor in Uganda. And because that's not what the mission had spearheaded, that didn't happen. So there's a lot of agency in terms of when people say they don't want something, but sometimes they do want to change. Sometimes they do want to transform their traditional practices to newer methods of doing agriculture or building their livelihoods. So I would say that the most important thing is really being respectful of communities. And I know that there has been a bad history all through colonialization and even in neocolonialism, where we do have the element of big donor agencies kind of coming in and apparently they want to do this thing or that other thing, but really going by the principles that the whole entire global community has agreed on, called the Rome principles, nothing about them without them. So we must always work with the local peoples and what they prefer to do. So another one, I saw a question also relating to GMOs and genetically modified, and that's another one where local communities may want it, actually. They want to get the GMO foods. And who are you to say that they can't buy it when you buy it in the United States? So so the point is that if people want it, they kind of want it, they want it. Now, you can't then, however, impose it on them, as has been the case in the past. So that's how I would respond to that question. Over.
Can I jump in here? I also think there's an interesting tension here, because at least in the way that like some people perceive, and I'm talking about even like in African societies or in the cities, like people who are not really familiar with agriculture perceive what it means to modernize agriculture, right? There's no question that we need to modernize agriculture, and it often is that you need to provide more irrigation, you need to build out more rural access roads, and all of that. But there's a perception that modernizing agriculture means becoming more like the US, right? Like all of the, intense commercialization and tilling, and when it comes to cattle feedlots, because that is more efficient. So I think that there's a tension here, right? Like in that sometimes some of the more historical methods of doing things were better for the earth, right? That's a part of why African countries are not emitting that much, right? It's not, so there's a tension between like, how do you improve productivity in a way that isn't actually causing more problem, and raising awareness around that. Because right now, when I see the conversation in Nigeria, it's like, well, we want to do the things that they're doing in America, which America is actually trying to move away from. So we need to kind of keep that in mind.
That's helpful. That's helpful. Why don't we take another question that came in also on the chat? The question is, can the panel address food production in the Middle East and North Africa, including the impacts of lack of food affecting particularly women globally? So we haven't brought up gender and women's control of crops or technology innovations. So do we have specific instances or in our experiences for either the Middle East or North Africa in terms of how women are impacted, through what's changing in the climate or through what's changing through our policies? Both good and bad opportunities probably to say, what's difficult or possibly what's improving. Sure, Claudia, please.
Maybe first on, I guess, food insecurity in the MENA region. So I've I think shown a couple of indicators of inequity in access to food. And so in terms of the MENA region, it's relatively better off.
You should say what MENA is. Can you say what?
Middle East and North Africa region. So in terms of that region, it's better off from an income and GDP perspective. And so what that region has been doing, for decades is importing food. They certainly can't grow enough food to sustain their current population. In fact, some of the countries, are growing food highly unsustainably in terms of, mining fossil groundwater, groundwater that will never, not in anyone's lifetime, but will be replenished. So there is, they should not grow staple foods. They should import them, conserve the little water they have for high value, service sector, outside agriculture, or a few greenhouse gas produced vegetable and fruit. So that's the direction these countries need to go, because simply they do not have the natural resources to produce food. So from that point of view, they're highly food insecure. Their food self-sufficiency goals can never be 100% because it's just not currently feasible. Of course, if we come up with completely new technologies, there are obviously, I'm not saying never, but it's under traditional methods is not possible. So from that point of view, they're highly food insecure, but because their GDPs, and obviously I don't want to generalize, but on average, it's higher than many of the poorer countries like Chad that Amaka has shown. In terms of gendered impacts, yes, we've done a lot of, for example, phone surveys, actually with support from USAID about impacts on diets and food insecurity in rural areas as a result of COVID. And yes, there definitely were gendered impacts. So we've often seen that women were the first ones who stopped eating 3 meals a day because obviously they want to provide for the children first, and then also for the main breadwinner, usually the men in the household. So yes, the impacts are gendered. We see that women often take a step back, that they're more malnourished, than the head of the household. And so, yeah, lots of challenges out there. Also, again, there's a big solution space and opportunities on how to reach women with meals through women's groups, school feeding programs for the children. Of course, COVID that was also obviously affected. Direct health services, direct support to women, and of course, increasing women's agency in agriculture. So that's another direct entryway to improve their food security. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Claudia. Those are great thoughts. Mafid or Amaka, do you have additional thoughts in your research or work?
USAID does not program a whole lot in agriculture for the Middle East, but we do have a few programs, notably Egypt, Jordan, a couple other places. Now, of course, a lot of the richer countries in the Middle East obviously already have a lot of income from petroleum. So they are not really categories that we've delved into, but we do have various partnerships, for instance, in education and technology. Actually, the Secretary of Agriculture just announced the Agricultural Innovation Mission innovation for agriculture that is in partnership with the United States and United Arab Emirates to really address key innovations in dealing with our future of agriculture. So those are really, really broad questions. But I think coming down to maybe some of the, to add on to elements Claudia raised, is the point that, yes, these are environments that I guess historically weren't super suitable for all kinds of agriculture. But of course, there are forms of agriculture, including pastoralism and cattle production. But of course, nowadays also with technology, when you kind of see what happens, say, in Israel with irrigation, very high-tech irrigation, and now looking into the future of agriculture with indoor farming and soilless farming, there is a lot of work that is potentially possible there. I know we have supported some innovation ventures as USAID to basically look at water use efficiencies or nutrient use efficiencies that really boost the production of sort of indoor farming. So to me, I think that's a huge promise for the future that could also be very inclusive, bringing the question of including women or otherwise marginalized members of the community in some of those areas. So I think that's what I would comment regarding that question.
That's great. Thank you. Amaka, anything else to add?
No, I think they've covered it. So
okay, good. Well, thank you. We have one more question. We gets us back into the policy realm. How can food policy help us think about sustainable size of the world's human population? So where do our policies for food create an opportunity for sustainable human population, or what role do we have in that, do you think? We've dealt with famines. The CGIAR, which Claudia and I have both worked in, is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year in terms of being able to get rid of famines that were going to be widespread in the 70s. And I know there's some technology issues since in terms of how that was addressed, but we have avoided mass famines as a result of the technologies that we have come through the United States and a lot of the land grant universities actually in our process. Moffat, what do you think?
Of course, this is a very sensitive issue, and I think history has kind of taught us a little bit to be wary of any kind of predictions. But of course, we can do a lot of modeling and anticipate certain scenarios and trends that we already see, and what that would portend for us as humanity, basically, on this planet. And I do not think that there's any use or any physical ways to really enforce that globally, rather than trying to think of a number that we mustn't exceed. I think the better option is part of what maybe I brought up earlier, from the standpoint of a public science, public understanding of science, and public understanding of how nature works, and how we feed ourselves, and how our bodies work, and all that. So as soon as we really help educate girls, educate communities, that problem will resolve itself. I don't think we need to be saying this is a cap that we mustn't exceed by 2050 or 2100. Rather, I feel like if we invest a lot more in education, we invest a lot more in agriculture research and options for really understanding ecology and our planet, understanding better our economic systems, working more on equality, because again, that is a key thing about who has power and who makes decisions. And if we are working more equally, I guess, from the approach of how our resources get allotted, then we find that we are moving toward a trajectory where people are going to make the right choices for their families and for their households, and we do not need to have rules or caps about how much. But of course, it's a crisis, and we do need all hands on deck. Research, of course, is a big bright light in terms of innovations, because we've innovated our way out of a lot of problems in the past. We are yet to see whether we will innovate ourselves out of this one, but the hope is high that we can.
Thank you. Does anyone else like to add to that? Claudia or Amaka?
I mean, Moffat already said female secondary education, in fact, is really one of the key interventions to ensure that family size is what families want the size to be, and obviously access to family planning, but otherwise, and obviously income growth. I mean, there's a very, very clear, one-on-one relationship between families with higher incomes and family size. So, but families that I've met, and I think many of you, in Africa, they would like access to family planning, but they don't have access. And obviously, we know, children are used as an insurance if there are no other insurance products, and if there is no education for girls, if there are no schools, if schools cost money. There's a lot of things that can be done, but definitely from a CGR perspective, our focus is to reduce food insecurity and not to affect population growth, because really through growing farm incomes, we don't have to directly work on this. I mean, as Moffat said, it sorts itself out, and across the world, it's a process. And as you probably all know, I mean, population growth is currently projected to really plateau going forward. So we are not moving into this forever spiral right now. So I think a lot of the changes are already ongoing and in place.
That's a hopeful message, actually, that we're getting there. Amaka, anything else to add? We do have a couple more questions too.
Yeah, sure. We can move on. I think they've answered it very well.
Okay, super. Well, let's see. We've got one. It's actually to Claudia more, but what do you think is the greatest opportunity to increase productivity? You talked about decreasing the amount of land we use and increasing production, but what is the best way we can go about that?
I mean, from all the research, I think that CGR and others have been doing, I don't want to just speak for CGR. I mean, definitely seed technologies. improved seeds have made the largest difference. It really has. I mean, just imagine if we would be at the yields of 40 years ago, how much land, there would be no more tropical forest really left. There would be no natural park if we would not have made the tremendous improvement in seed technology. So that is the number one. But as Moffat also said, there are other innovations, and we have been able to innovate ourselves out of a lot of problems. And it just, I've done a little bit of research recently on cultured milk protein. It sounds strange, so but you can grow milk protein in a lab. You can convert it. Ice cream is already available from cultured milk protein. Costs can come down if there and investors are out there. So if you convert, you can produce milk powder, can make that more cheaply available going forward in low and middle income countries, increase access to animal source food, reduce the number of milk cattle that's out there, meet a huge unmet demand that's out there without necessarily displacing traditional milk producers, at least in low and middle income countries. So that is one of these innovations where you really innovate yourselves out of a lot of challenges if this moves forward.
Right. Well, and that actually goes to your other point earlier, and I think everyone's alluded to it a little bit about waste diversion in terms of the global food system. How do we see waste disposal issues of products such as plastics and food waste? Recycling, compost, how do they influence the climate impact as well as disproportionately affect people of different communities globally? Where do we see waste is coming into our policy overviews, as well as what the measures we're taking now, recycling and compost, and how those might be impacting those in developing countries or globally? Do you have thoughts on that, everyone? I know we've talked about a Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, there's definitely some very interesting research and attempts to turn waste into energy, right? In parts of sub-Saharan Africa and other low-income countries that are very energy poor. So I think that's a very interesting use. And then I just wanted to add to the answer about increasing agricultural productivity from the perspective of kind of low-income countries, middle-income countries, low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Yes, improved seedlings, yes, some more fertilizer use, but I think we don't talk enough about the role of rural infrastructure, right? Like, say, for example, Nigeria, I would say more than half of tomatoes produced, grown, actually perish before they ever get to market, in part because, rural access roads are non-existent or really poor. And storage is so bad, is so poor, right? Like, you need cold storage systems, even grain storage systems, but especially cold storage systems. That's an area that I would say policy really needs to focus on improving and investing in to improve productivity. So a lot of this stuff, it doesn't even require like major technological inventions. It's like pretty basic stuff. Build some roads, build some storage facilities, and it will go a long way towards improving agricultural productivity. Plus, just also do the things that mitigate conflicts, right? For a lot of the Sahel region, conflict is the major obstacle to productivity.
Yeah, thank you. Those are excellent points.
Yeah, I was going to add that very important points there. The whole idea of waste and how big it's become, especially when you kind of think about plastics, is partially coming from how we've sort of segmented our economies. And I think a lot of the energy coming off of the United Nations Food System Summit is really to say that our economies are one thing. And we need to think about whatever it is that I'm producing, whatever I think I'm wasting, actually kind of needs to go into another sector or another use, so that we have this sort of circular economy kind of frame. And from the traditional way of doing agriculture, it was just natural. It's what nature does. Is you whatever you have as your refuse, it kind of goes into the land. It improves the soil, and it's just all cycling. Everything is cycling. So we've kind of moved away from that over the last, say, 200 years of industrialization. And to me, I think a key solution is obviously going to be in harkening back and bringing back that circular framing of our economies, and suddenly bringing back that within agriculture, where we are really kind of thinking about what do we need to use for what? Are we using just the right amount? We don't need to use more than that. And whatever we say is waste, or whatever gadgets or other things we use, how can they be repurposed? So you mentioned, Amaka, something like storage, and the food loss that we get. I mean, it's massive. I mean, wholly a third of all emissions is just coming from, or some such figure I think I've seen somewhere, is coming from food that's wasted, that was produced, that was never consumed. And so how do we actually reduce that food loss and food waste? How do we then also become more efficient and more more productive? So basically this concept of sustainable intensification, so that we are producing more with less. And then whatever else we say is waste, we are actually repurposing that. So that's a huge thing that kind of takes a mind shift to really happen. And I think it needs to come all the way from the top, because policies and part of what the discussions happening at the United Nations level, at national levels, at domestic sort of local areas, this is all very, very important. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Can I add one thing on this? I mean, if you want to move on, that's also fine, but it relates to a question I see in the chat. You know, when Moffat was talking about the circular economy, there's this question that says, what efforts are being made to integrate agriculture, research, development, and sustainable practices with existing practices, right? And I think that what's happening in Nigeria now is a very important case study in this, because the traditional practice of, you know, pastoralists grazing the land when after the harvest to like help kind of take away the hooves and clean it up or whatever, and then drop in manure, which helps to make it more fertile, which a lot of that has been displaced in part because of climate change, because rain patterns are changing, blah, blah. And right now, the proposal to try and co-locate some of these ranches near grazing areas and like have actual trained farm managers, you know, get some data to figure out like what's happening with rain patterns, and then you could maybe, you know, give information to pastoralists, right, about like, okay, so these guys have finished planting, maybe actually there's pasture this way, right? Like right now, these guys are planting, don't go this way, you know, whatever, like that sort of information. I think this could be a very interesting experiment model, right? If it works to kind of follow. And I would say to like help make it work, right? To like use some of these practices that bring back some of the old practices that are not available now because of climate change, but using technology to predict sort of, you know, what's happening with rainfalls and whatever, to direct movement in the right way could help to mitigate conflict, as well as, you know, just be a healthier way to increase productivity than just pouring chemicals.
That's excellent. You know, I think, can you hear me? Am I coming through? Great. I have two more questions. Let's take a look at how do global agricultural problems affect Coloradoans? And you guys have done a wonderful job of sort of setting the stage and giving us the big picture. And I know, Moffat, you studied here with us in Colorado and got your PhD from CSU. And so I think, and you've all are from other countries and have had a chance to work and live in the United States as well. So when you're looking at our global issues and how it translates into why we should care, why we should be engaged and a part of it, what would you like to say to our audience in terms of global ag issues affecting those of us at the state level? Who wants to tackle that first?
This is a very exciting one for me, because it's indeed that we are all on this sort of pale blue dot, you know, our planet here, and we are interconnected. And I believe one of the biggest ones that's very pertinent right now is in kind of looking at disease ecology, and part of what we see with emerging diseases that I guess for a long time have been thought of as being tropical diseases or a tropical burden. We are seeing changing occurrences and global travel, but also just what we're observing with climate change is sort of opening up new niches for all kinds of organisms. And so that's just one big one. Obviously, right now we're in the throes of COVID recovery, and who knows what else we might be able to get. So the extent to which we as communities, say in Colorado, could help understand what's happening elsewhere in the world. How can we help solve problems? I know there's a very good veterinary unit at University of up in CSU, and they do very important work in terms of understanding epidemiology, both of livestock diseases, but also pests and so on. So that's a very important, big one that has a big impact on people in Colorado right now. So actually we are facing, I don't know whether, I believe Secretary Vilsack, when he came to Colorado last week, probably mentioned a little bit the African swine fever as something that has already hit the Hispaniola island in Dominican Republic and Haiti. And if, God forbid, something like that kind of hits the United States, I mean, it's going to be massive, massive impact on this country and in the agriculture sector. So if we have the tools, if we have the networks, if we have the understanding to have conversations with each other, we are able to tackle those problems well. So that's just one, but I'll also highlight another one relating to what I mentioned earlier in my opening comments about that the United States government supports a lot of research overseas. But what we're also seeing is that research overseas comes right back to the United States in terms of supporting and helping boost agricultural systems here in the United States, and certainly the economy here in the United States. So I'll mention those two. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for mentioning, we have in the midst of African swine fever vaccine production, possibly out of Colorado State University, and something we're very keen and aware of, in collaboration with one of our CGIAR centers called the International Livestock Research Institute in Kenya. So, I mean, the interconnectedness, you're completely right, Moffat, how connected we are and how much we rely on each other. Amaka and Claudia, would you like to answer that before we move on to our next question, please?
Go ahead, Claudia, and then I'll go after you.
Yeah, so I guess for me, I would just say more generally, so low income countries import, they need to import a growing share of their food because agricultural productivity has not taken off, including in Nigeria. I mean, there are good signs in various countries, Rwanda, Ethiopia, etc. But despite that, every year, these countries currently import more food. And that food has to be produced somewhere. They import more food because populations are still growing faster than agricultural productivity. And of course, we are, as I've showed you, the number of undernourished children is still large and too large, but it's going down. So that means, someone is getting more food, and that food has to come from somewhere. So the United States remains one of those countries, United States, Europe, and are still the key regions where, those countries that can produce enough food, including the MENA region that we talked about, but also Sub-Saharan Africa, are importing their food from. And so I think, why does it matter? The United States does produce surplus food. Canada does as well, at least in some of these commodities, of course, not in chocolate bars, but in some commodities, and those are essential for global food security. So it's, I think, very important for countries like the United States to not abandon agriculture, to also not abandon agricultural sciences, to not abandon agricultural technologies, but to continue to innovate in that sector, because there are many countries out there that, for various reasons, currently cannot produce enough food. And so we do need this collaboration. We do need the continued trade, continued global trade, continued global support from rich countries like the United States for these poorer countries that are, whose net food import dependency keeps growing. And then obviously technology exchange. So there's so much going on. I mean, swine fever vaccine is one, and the irrigation technologies, precision agriculture technologies. So a lot of the tools that are being developed in like at CSU and other universities, they might be, you know, they are expensive, but then the idea is to develop low cost versions of these tools, make them available in you know, sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, where, you know, the scope for their transformation of agricultural system is huge, is tremendous. So technology exchange, capacity building, educating students. So there's so many important, so many reasons of why this is all important for Colorado and CSU.
Thank you. I want to hear from Amaka, and then I want to ask our last question. We're actually at 7 minutes to go for our seminar. So Amaka, why do you think it's important, and why does this affect Coloradoans and others throughout the United States?
You know, I think it affects, I don't want to focus on the negative, so I'll focus on the positive. There's of course negative reasons to care about what's happening in low-income countries, right? Because conflicts and instability abroad will ultimately come and affect us in the United States as it has in the past. But on a more positive note, you want, you know, in terms of advancing global prosperity, the more you kind of care and focus on agricultural productivity abroad, the bigger your market is for American companies, so European companies. That's people with more and better incomes and wages that they can spend on buying American goods, right? So bigger pie for everybody. And the one thing I would just say to the point, I do want to say, I think it's important that we acknowledge as Americans that a lot of our agricultural practices are not necessarily fair, and not necessarily like saying, okay, yes, well, these countries can't produce all the food, so like we should produce more and give it to them in aid. There's a good argument to be made that that's not necessarily, that could be more harmful than helpful, right? Because because of different political realities, American policy subsidizes inefficient agriculture that harms the entire global food structure, right? And it actually makes it harder for farmers that could be competitive to be competitive, because this very rich country has a lot of money to throw on inefficient production that actually harms the environment, right? So, you know, I think we should also think about that. I don't think we should only think about it as, yes, this is a good thing that we're producing more surplus so we can give it to them in aid, when we could actually stop giving all those subsidies and use that money instead to invest in the things that will help with productivity in those countries, right? Instead of giving them food and harming the entire food ecosystem.
Interesting. Okay, good. Well, listen, I appreciate you guys have put in so much work, and we appreciate all your good thoughts and how this came together and what you bring to the table in this conversation. And I'd like to end on a hopeful note. What is it that gives you hope when you look into the future of your own careers and lives, and for those who come after us? And with regard to climate change and our global food systems, what are you hopeful about? Who would like to start? Amaka, do you want to start?
I'll start. You know, I actually was extremely inspired by the Kiss the Ground movie. And I'm not just saying that because I don't even know who is involved in doing it, because I learned a lot from it. And I learned about that some of the practices that we're currently struggling with in a lot of African countries might actually be better in some ways, right, for the soil and the environment. And there's a way to, and it's a reminder that you can modernize without westernizing, which is very important, I think, for people to remember. So I think my hope is that we can build more awareness about these issues. We can build more awareness globally about the role that climate change is playing, and the ways that we can use more innovative, you know, modernized without westernizing, without whatever idea of like, it doesn't have to be crazy, commercial, hyper-intensive agriculture in order for it to be modern and more productive.
Cool, thank you. Claudia.
Yep, I mean, I guess I fully agree with Amaka. I kind of want to see that movie now. I haven't made it yet. Yeah, and I mean, I've mentioned and also what Moffat said, let's innovate. We have to continue to invest in research and innovation, both scientific part, the practices part, the institutional part. Institutions also matter, how communities need to come together. How do people in communities come together? So we need to innovate everywhere. And as I mentioned already, this cultural protein example, I think, that really can help reduce some of the pressure at the margin. I don't expect that everyone will be consuming cultural proteins in 20 years, but it can relieve some pressure and at the margin, and it can really, I think, make a difference. It's something to look further into. Yeah, thank you.
Good. Thank you. Moffat, what gives you hope?
For me, it's really discovery and human ingenuity. As we face sort of we reach the precipice of climate change and all the challenges we face today, and insecurity and all the challenges, I feel that human innovation and human solutions, particularly as we experience this information age and the solutions that are emerging relating to digital solutions, from artificial intelligence to machine learning to all that, I think you can easily think about a very scary picture of robots taking over. But to be honest, I see a lot of hope and a lot of opportunity there if we do collective action to utilize the tools and ideas that we have to really to improve standards of living everywhere. So I'm very, very hopeful about that.
Great. Thank you so much. Kristin, back to you, dear. And
thank you. Yeah. Oh my goodness. This was a wonderful session. A huge thank you to all of you for your insights and your thoughtfulness and your brilliance. I've got so many notes